All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Grounded Live episode. I'm here with Stuart Johnson, the normal host. How are you doing, Stu?
Good, thanks, Kyle. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing really well. I am so excited to talk soil carbon. We're all here. We love soil, but carbon, I mean, it's such a special topic and essential, and it's something that I think needs to be better understood for producers, but also for many other reasons. So I'm really excited to dive into it, and we have a panel of guests today. So I think we'll start out with introductions. I don't think there's a formal order. So first on my screen is Luke. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name's Luke. I'm the CEO of Nature Broking. We work with organizations to help them achieve their sustainability goals through investing in nature and climate in the UK.
Very good. Thank you, Luke. Next up is George.
Hi everyone, I'm George Hosier, farm in Wiltshire. Been sort of going down the regenerative route for nearly 10 years now. And I'm just coming on board with Kyle and Stuart to help them with a bit of the mentoring side as well.
Very good. Thank you, George. Tom?
Hello everyone, my name is Tom Dillon and I'm a Director of Regenerative Outcomes. We're running a soil health program here in the UK.
Perfect. And last but not least, I see Matt.
Good to see everyone. Matt Jordan, beef and sheep farmer, just outside of Alnwick in Northumberland, and also Chief Scientific Officer at Regenerative Outcomes.
Very good. Thank you very much. We'll be hearing from you shortly. But Stu, when we talk about soil organic matter and building it up, what have you seen on your farm as you've made regenerative changes? Have you seen a difference in color, difference in plant productivity? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I certainly think that we've improved the cycling of carbon, in and out of our soils. I definitely think we've got more aggregates in there, which is obviously a good thing. You and I always talk on about aggregates all the time and how important that is, and fundamentally that's carbon right there. I don't know a huge amount of about the carbon of the science and everything that goes on behind in terms of the measurements of it and stuff like that. So I'm quite interested to hear a bit more about that from my point of view. So yeah, I'm like you said before, quite looking forward to getting some unknowns known now. So I'm looking forward to this. So
yep, and boy,
how about you, Kyle? You're out on the road all the time. You're obviously digging a lot of holes. You know a lot more about carbon than I do. So
tons of holes. I mean, carbon is so important. It's like water and air. Like carbon is just as essential as those elements in the soil, and it's kind of a shame that carbon's become kind of a boogeyman or a scared word, or a word that brings some fear, because it is essential. We're carbon-based life, and as producers, we're producing carbon-based life, right? So the more we can cycle it, the more carbon we can get in the system, and turning and cycling, that's why it's called the carbon cycle, the more profitable we can be. So, but speaking on the science of it, we have just the man to ask. Matt, what is soil carbon?
Well, I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head by starting the conversation on soil organic matter. So, I think when we think about carbon as farmers, as you say, Kyle, it can seem a bit of an alien concept, but we're really familiar with organic matter in our soils. We see it all the time on typical soil samples we'll send off to the lab for pK, pH. There'll often be organic matter on there as well. And all carbon is in the soil it's present in the form of, predominantly present in the form of organic matter. And so organic matter is around 50% carbon by weight. And so that just means that of all the things that the organic matter is made up from, carbon is kind of 50% of that. And that organic matter is obviously, the proportion of the soil that's derived from living things. So bits of dead plant, animal manure, dead microbes, and so on. And so, as Stu was kind of saying, in terms of aggregates, it's the organic matter in the soil that turns your sand, your silt, and your clay particles into a soil with structure and with aggregates that kind of does everything we want from a soil. But yeah, it's kind of going from the kind of slightly alien concept to the thing that we're used to day on farm.
Absolutely. And, when you think about life, what's it made up of mostly? Your macromolecules, protein, carbs, fats, and genetic material. And all of those have carbon-based backbones, right? And so how does carbon go from in the air as CO2 into those life forms? It's photosynthesis. So for me, this whole talk about soil carbon, it all comes down to photosynthesis. How can we get more photosynthesis, photosynthates pumped onto the land, and cycling? Because when you actually look at the accounting for carbon on a landscape, it's cycle. It's like a bank account. There's some going in and there's always going to be some going out. And it just so happens with the past 80, 100 years, whatever you want to say, of farming, a lot we've farmed in such a way where a lot more has come out than what we've put back in. And so I just think the way to conceptualize it now is we're at a time where we've drained that bank account, that soil carbon bank account, because that's the living things doing the beneficial processes, and it's the food and it's the structure. Carbon is everything in there. And we've gassed off a lot of that in the past 100 years. So we have to do something to bring more carbon back into the system. You know, you could, for climatic reasons, yes, but also for farm productivity reasons. So George, on your farm, have you seen a difference in soil carbon, soil organic matter levels, and any increases in productivity as you've potentially done so?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of actual soil organic matter and soil carbon, you know, we've done a little bit of soil sampling over the years and seen a steady increase. But in terms of proper baselining, we did that 3 years ago, and we're in fact going to have a little bit of interim testing done in the next few weeks to see where that's gone in terms of true soil carbon. But in terms of productivity and resilience, we've definitely seen an improvement, particularly in our grassland and herbal lays. You know, this year's been incredibly dry for most of us, and certainly here we hardly saw any measurable rainfall between the end of February and middle of August. And you know, we were in a pretty strong position in terms of grazing. We didn't have to feed any hay or silage or any other bought-in feed through the summer, and we've still got plenty of grub in front of the cows now. So that, for me, you know, the extra water holding capacity that increased soil organic matter brings to the system, we're really seeing the benefits of that. And I think, you know, it's important that we talk about carbon, but you know, carbon isn't the only metric by which we can measure the health of our soils, but it's a really good indicator.
Absolutely. Carbon is life, and the more life you have, life begets life, you know, and that's a huge cost savings that you just explained there with more life in your soils. Stu, what about you? This summer's been pretty challenging for you. How have your soils fared?
Yeah, it's been a tough one again this year, hasn't it? But we've done all right, I think, in terms of we haven't been feeding, we haven't been, you know, turning out a lot of concentrates and stuff like that. Like much like George says there, the resilience in the system still not as good as I want it to be at all by any stretch of the imagination. But we are way more resilient than we were sort of 5-10 years ago in terms of how much we can ride through these dry periods, shall we say? So. Yeah, it's been a tough year, much as everyone's had. Rainfall's been really, really poor, but we've just about got through. Nice back end. This back end makes things a lot easier as well. But it's been a tough year, but we've done all right. Mm-hmm. I think what you were saying before, you know, that dirty word that carbon is. I think a lot of the time carbon gets this rap as being the villain of the piece, and often as farmers, we can maybe get caught up in that as well, that we think maybe, you know, carbon is, but actually we need it cycling in and out all the time, as you said before, that makes the whole system tick. And I don't think the education piece that many farmers get from the usual places sort of teach that to you. So it's really important that we can get this message out, hopefully today as well, and when we get a bit more clarity from some of these people who are much more in the know than I am, but they can hammer that message home of how important it is that carbon is cycling around the place and how they can go about measuring it to make sure that one, we've got more in there, and two, that we hopefully get rewarded for what's in there as well. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it's definitely a public service to have healthier soils and higher carbon soils. So, for me, it only makes sense that for farmers are providing that public service, you should have that option to get paid for that public service you're providing. So, Robert asked in the chat, where does George farm? He farms in Wiltshire near Marlborough. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
On the Wiltshire, Hampshire, Berkshire border.
Very good. Thank you. So yeah, in speaking about testing that soil for its carbon levels, Matt, I'm going to bring you back in. What exactly is involved in measuring soil carbon?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, as farmers, we're quite familiar with organic matter readings, and we would typically get that in the usual way with sample soils by just walking a W pattern across a field and taking 20 or 25 cores, mixing them all up and send them off to the lab. And that way we get a really good representation of the average across the field. But when we're thinking about carbon in particular, we're not just interested in the carbon content expressed as a percentage, that organic matter percentage that we're used to. We also want to know the stock, which is the tons of carbon. So not just the percentage of the soil that is carbon, but then how many tons of carbon that gives us across the whole field or across the whole farm. And so when we're thinking about measuring carbon rather than just organic matter, yes, we need the carbon content as a percentage, but we also need what's called the bulk density, and multiplying those two together plus the sample depth gives you that measure in tons of carbon per hectare. So for example, we might expect an arable field to say have between 40 to 80 tons of carbon per hectare down to 30 centimeters, and then permanent grassland could be up to say 120 tons of carbon per hectare. And so I suppose that the first thing is to say you need to measure the carbon content plus the bulk density. The second is sample depth. So often when we're just measuring for common nutrients on farm, we would consider 10 or 15 centimeters to be a good depth to go, because that's where most plant roots are. So it's the most relevant kind of zone for crop nutrition. But when we're thinking about carbon measurement, often we want to go much deeper than that. So down to 30 centimeters is a minimum. And then often there's benefit to going deeper than that even. And that part of the reason for that is a lot of the potential for us as farmers to continue to increase carbon on our farm is actually further down the soil profile. So often, as I'm sure you see all the time out on farm, the top 5-10 centimeters of the soil often looks really good, and then it kind of turns into that kind of lighter colored, more subsoil material quite quickly, and that's where the real potential is to build aggregates and then store more carbon as well. And then the final thing to think about really is where you take the samples. So when we're going and baselining a farm to get a good measure of tons of carbon across the farm, we're not just doing a W in each field. We're thinking about where to place cores across the farm in a way that captures the variation within the farm and gives a really meaningful result that will then stand the test of time.
Great, thanks so much. When you were speaking, I think it's pronounced Evie. She made a really, really pertinent comment, and I just wanted to mention it. She says, carbon is the only villain because folks call CO2 carbon. They equate the two, right? Now, of course, CO2, C being carbon, is part of that carbon dioxide molecule, but I think what people really need to understand is elements, atoms, nutrients are like Legos. They're constantly bonding to other ones, but they're staying the same Lego, if that makes sense. So that CO2, as the plant ingests it, turns it into sugar, turns it into exudate, the microbes eat it, the microbe dies, that cycles, that becomes long-term soil carbon. That was the same Lego that went through that cycle, right? And so when people equate carbon as a whole giant group of atoms into CO2 being bad, it is so misguided. You're absolutely right. And I just wanted to mention that while it was top of mind. So Tom, I'm going to bring you in now. Why is soil carbon being tested now? Why is this practice being done and being more popular at this point in time?
Yeah, I guess taking a big step back, as Evie pointed out, that the villain is carbon dioxide and the excessive amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So global warming is seeming to accelerate. The last couple of years have been the hottest on record, and essentially society is facing the question of how do we draw down this excessive carbon dioxide? And nature offers various ecosystems which are carbon sinks, such as peatland, woodland, oceans, mangroves, etc. And it just so happens that productive farmland can also be a carbon sink. So if you as a farmer are restoring that functional natural ecosystem in your soils, essentially you're providing that service which you mentioned earlier to society. So who pays for this service? Government pay in the form of subsidies, so SFI and landscape recovery and other programs are very much driven by climate goals, the 25-year environment plan, etc. So within the subsidies are embedded a commitment by the government to tackle climate change, but also the private sector is willing to come to the table as well. So the carbon market for the private sector is split into two parts. You have the compliance carbon market, which was set up by the government in 2021. Essentially, it's an emissions trading scheme whereby big polluting industries like shipping and waste management and energy, they have caps set on their emissions, which reduce every year according to government targets to hit net zero as an economy by 2050. So the government has set these caps, they're reducing every year. The businesses in those sectors are essentially having to hit those caps, and companies that pollute over that cap have to buy allowances or credits essentially from other companies that have managed to reduce their emissions. So it's a cap and trade market. It's worth about £2.5 billion a year, and it's active. And that's different to the voluntary carbon market. Farmland credits can't be sold into the compliance carbon market, but they very much are in scope for voluntary carbon market, which Luke will come on to in a bit more detail. But essentially, that compliance market is pulling along other companies that aren't legally obliged to cap and cut emissions, but they want to anyway, for a number of commercial reasons, be it winning market share, complying with new reporting regulations, recruiting talent, etc. So there's a number of sort of commercial reasons for companies to cut their emissions, even if they aren't legal obligations. And what's happening is those companies are cutting emissions, but they tend to be left with a residual surplus of emissions. So they seek good projects to essentially balance out that surplus of emissions to hit net zero by their targets. So, as I said, they have a range of nature-based carbon projects to choose from. Farmland projects is a relatively new space for the voluntary carbon market. But appetite seems to be there. Luke will elaborate on that. I think the important point here is that government will pay farms for actions which might be climate beneficial, but the private sector are focused on outcomes. And this is why measurement of soil carbon stocks is so critical, because the buyers of these credits are very, they have their eyes on the quality of data being produced by the projects if they're putting money on the table. So it's very important for them that soil carbon stocks are measured as part of a soil carbon project. And I guess the final point is some of the cheaper carbon models which are currently in use and being used by farms to calculate their farm emissions are not factoring in the sequestration of carbon into their soils. So that is a very major piece that's missing from some carbon models. And a good measurement protocol it actually provides a fairer and more representative carbon balance sheet, if you like, of the farm. because yes, the farm's emitting on one end of the scales, but if farmland is managed in such and such a way, which you guys teach about, that potential of sequestration into the soils is a very major piece of the farm's carbon balance sheet. So I think it's a critical cog to represent farms, particularly livestock farms, where animals play such a critical role in building soil health, building soil carbon stocks. Getting that fair representation, I think, is quite important.
Thanks for that. And can you touch on, I think you did for a second there, but like what's the difference between a high integrity credit or process and maybe a lower one, and who sets those, who determines what's high integrity?
Yeah, it's banded around quite a lot now, high integrity. So I guess it's better to start with, so a buyer, if they want to buy a soil carbon credit, what is the process? So commonly they will seek a carbon standard, which essentially is a rule book which generates a carbon credit. So for example, the gold standard or the verified carbon standard, and the buyer that will almost be the first gateway for them to come to the table and put, essentially agree to buy credits. They do their due diligence on the standard. They get comfortable with how the project is being managed under those rules, and then they come to the table and start doing more analysis on the project. So it's really important that the standard is in place. Measurement is just a piece of generating a carbon credit. The rule book that surrounds that is arguably as or more important. So that very briefly, they will set rules on how to measure. So science is continuously feeding into these standards, best practices, how to model and measure carbon accurately. They will set rules on additionality, which is essentially, it's an assessment of what the farm is doing differently. Why is the farm different and going beyond business as usual? Because if you think about it from the buyer's perspective, they don't want to commit money to farms that are just doing business as usual. So there's various additionality tests, which we don't have to go into now, but essentially that underpins the value of the credit. We have to prove that the farm is going above and beyond on a different course, and then the buyers are willing to pay. It also sets rules on permanence. So if I'm a company and I buy a carbon credit, I want that to be a permanent removal in the case of drawdown. And if it so happens that a farm decides to leave the project early, there's essentially a buffer of credits that are withheld from every transaction to cater for that risk. So as a buyer, I'm always kept whole. I'm always there's a replenishment of credits within that buffer pool, which is really important, because I don't want to pay for a credit and then ultimately that credit has no value if all the activities are being reversed on the ground or the farm leaves, etc., etc. So again, that is one of the key components of the standard that the buyers review in that first gateway. They want to understand, okay, how are these credits going to deliver permanent impact? And then good governance, making sure the project developer's financially robust, got good systems in place, collects data in such a way, is going to be around in 40 years, because a lot of these, as Luke might talk about later, the core carbon principles, for example, setting a 40-year horizon on many good quality carbon projects. So it's no good having a fragile project developer. Again, it's another piece of the risk profile of the project. So, and lastly, all of these rules of on most standards, they have to be a third-party verifier has to come in and essentially verify that the developer has complied with all the rules. So again, that's another level of trust and assurance for the buyers. So yeah, all in all, say measurement is just a cog of creating a carbon credit.
Before we deviate too far, thanks for Tom, by the way, that's hugely helpful. That, but before we deviate too far away from it, Evie's popped up again with a question. So why is soil carbon emitted by most carbon audits? I don't know if you or Matthew wants to answer that, or whoever thinks the best place to do that. But why is that not counted by a lot of these carbon calculators?
Cost, expensive.
Cost.
We'll come on to that at the end. But Matt, do you have any other comments?
Well, I think that carbon audits were predominantly designed as a farm management tool, decision-making tool. So if you look at something like AgriCalc, it was kind of born out of the beef efficiency scheme run by the Scottish Government, for example, and the focus was on how to improve efficiency within beef herds and thinking about reducing emissions from the farm. And they were kind of designed to help farmers think about ways they could reduce their emissions rather than necessarily being used to calculate a farm's net carbon position. And so there's kind of two different objectives, isn't there? You can have a conversation of, well, how can I optimize my fertilizer use, or where the incremental savings I can make on diesel, or are there ways in which I could improve daily live weight gains in my finishing stock, for example. And that's a useful conversation to have on farm, but it's certainly not the question of, is my farm net zero, carbon positive, carbon negative, whatever it is. And so I think that the sequestration element in soils and also hedges, trees and things have kind of often been kind of bolted onto the back end of some of these carbon calculators that were designed to do a different thing originally. But the problem is, as Tom's kind of alluded to, you can the way they've been set up is you can make a reasonable estimate of what a cow would be emitting given its body weight and what it's eating, for example. But because soils are so variable, it's very difficult to come up with meaningful low cost, light touch ways of estimating it in the same way. So you could probably plug in some organic matter contents for some fields on the farm, but it's not going to give you the same level of rigor and I guess validity ultimately as doing a more comprehensive baseline approach.
Thanks for that, Matt. Stuart, if I may...
just to wrap up on that, I suppose that the other point you make is that the carbon audits at the moment are commonly being used by the food supply chain. So your abattoir might require you to do a carbon audit, or your milk wholesaler might require you to do a carbon audit. And typically they don't want to have to incur large cost to get you to do that. So these things, they're off the shelf, either free or very low cost. Whereas to go down the measuring soil carbon approach, it only becomes worthwhile if you've got an end market for the credit or the outcome from that. And that's why, if the aim is to generate a verified carbon credit, you can then afford to go and do that testing in a way that if you're a wholesaler and you just want to know the emissions in your supply chain, you can't afford necessarily to do that.
Very good. Thank you for that. Yep. Yeah, the chat's popping off. Love it. Love it. Just want to keep on top of it. So David asked a very good question, Matt. I think this is in your purview. He said, have you managed to convince academia that carbon levels have not got an upper limit in the soil? So can you talk a little bit about, and I think later on, I'm going to bolt on his further question. How does the testing distinguish between permanent stable carbon as opposed to cycling carbon in the soil? So maybe go into a little bit about POM versus other types of organic matter carbon, how it cycles, being the whiz that you are.
I don't know about that. Cool. Yeah. So I think that on the saturation point. So maybe just to provide a bit of context for the wider audience. So if you carry out the same management practices on a field for an extended period of time, you'll be putting the same amount of carbon into the soil through photosynthesis of the arable crops you're growing, or the permanent pasture that's in the field, or whatever it might be. And that carbon will reach an equilibrium. So as Kyle, you were describing earlier, you've got the kind of bank balance dynamic where there's always carbon coming in, there's carbon coming out. And if you keep doing the same thing for long enough, those two things will match. So you'll end up with essentially a microbial community in the soil that's eating or digesting the carbon that's being introduced to the soil by plants and animals at the same rate, and it reaches that equilibrium. And there's really compelling data for that from lots of different studies and things that basically show if you for example, if you transition an arable field to permanent grass, the carbon increases, then it plateaus, it reaches that equilibrium. But there's also as the question alludes to, there's also a school of thought that there comes a point where you cannot sequester any more carbon in the soil. So not only do you reach an equilibrium, but you can actually get to the point where it's not the equilibrium that's just from that set of management, it's actually that you can't increase the carbon any further. And I guess, Kyle, as you were describing, there's two main forms of carbon in the soil, or organic matter in the soil. You've got mineral associated organic matter and then particulate organic matter. And the mineral associated organic matter, as the name would suggest, binds stably to mineral particles in the soil, so particularly clay. And this is why you will hear people talk about higher clay soils having higher organic matter. It's because there's more of those binding sites available in the soil for the organic matter to be stably bound to. And there is really good evidence that mineral associated organic matter does saturate. So once you've filled up all your binding sites with a bit of organic matter, that's it done. But there's also good evidence now available from across Europe, in fact, that shows that even once your mineral associated organic matter is saturated, you can still keep sequestering carbon through building particulate organic matter. So that's kind of your semi-decomposed plant material and things, bits of dead microbes and so on, that are kind of existing in the soil structure but not necessarily locked up to a clay particle in the same way. Now, it's important to note that, you know, a mineral associated organic matter is relatively more stable because it's kind of, you know, glued to your mineral particles, but it's not you know, immune to degradation, right? So microbes are then redigesting that and respiring something back out as CO2. It's still cycling, just on a slower timescale. And so when we're thinking about going and doing a carbon test or carbon baseline, when we sample the soil, we don't actually distinguish between the mineral associated stuff and the particulate stuff, because we know that they're both cycling, maybe on different timescales, but they're both cycling. And ultimately, if a farmer is managing in a way that's building carbon, they'll be kind of spinning both up at the same time. And so we're taking a snapshot of the bank balance. Now, in your bank balance, you might have your savings pot and your spending pot, and the spending pot's going out and coming in, and the savings pot's kind of sat there. But actually, if you just look at your bank balance, it's the headline figure that you're interested in. And we approach carbon testing in much the same way.
Thanks, Matt. That makes a lot of sense. And I know Gabe has talked about in one of his presentations, he's a picture of, you know, his land, and then 5 years later, he's built up this basically peaty material. And he said, you know, some people don't call that soil, but he's like, I don't care what it is. It's carbon. It's organic matter that I've put on the surface of my soil that wasn't there 5 years ago. And so, yeah, that would be more of that particular organic matter. It's not bound to any minerals, any clay in the soil, but it's still there lying in the soil, and it's energy, it's nutrients for the whole system. So yeah, I don't see why there would be any upper limit.
I think that it's all about rate as well, isn't it? So like if you're starting from a good basis, most of your carbon sequestration potential is going to be in your low organic matter soil below 15 centimeters, and that's where you're going to make the rapid gains. And then, you know, as you're describing, kind of starting to build up that particulate organic matter, that's where you get to after 5, 10, 20, 30 years. So, you know, if a farmer starts farming in this way, they shouldn't necessarily expect to see that, you know, in the first year or two. It's that kind of longer term benefit from really starting to get the soil functioning really well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Now, Luke, we haven't heard from you. Can I ask you a question? You still awake?
Sure. I mean, I've been trying to answer Ruth's basic auto plan question all the time. So, just...
All right, Luke, where is the demand for soil carbon credits actually coming from?
So I think you have to look at this in terms of what corporates are looking for in terms of being able to kind of mitigate their emissions. Now, you know, a lot of people determine, you know, what is a carbon credit, you know, when does a corporate use it, and if they are using it, are they just greenwashing? And I think there's two facets to this. So corporations are looking to mitigate their impact, and then by and large reducing. So where we're seeing demand come from a corporate point of view is twofold. One is, as they decarbonize, there are times in which they may decarbonize faster or slower than they expect. And so during that time that they decarbonize faster or slower than they expect, they can choose to be a part of a program, you know, corporate sustainable responsibility, corporate and social responsibility, and also as part of their kind of commitment to helping their customers. And so they can use that credit during that process as they decarbonize, or indeed during for when they become net zero. So when organizations achieve net zero, it's called net zero. So the net of net zero, I think, is really important to realize. It's very difficult for the world the world, but taking it down to a micro level for individual organizations to be true zero, there is always going to be an impact. We haven't, at the time, we've not discovered a way of decarbonizing the grid. We've not discovered ways in which we can decarbonize air travel. So there's always going to be an amount of, and it's not just carbon, it's every form of GWP or global warming gases out there that are pulling in. I think we bucket everything under the carbon umbrella, but there's methane emissions, there's hydrofluorocarbons, etc., that all get equated down to CO2e is just a sort of fungible token or sort of standard score associated with the global warming potential. And I think, and so what these organizations are doing is they're saying, well, if I know that I'm not going to be able to achieve net zero, but I'm decarbonizing as far as I possibly can go, I need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And if I'm removing carbon from the atmosphere, then I can then have that net zero position. And what's really interesting is that a lot of organizations, particularly larger organizations who have made that commitment to decarbonize, are starting to see this kind of this opportunity, but also this way in which they can partner with amazing programs like Regenerate Outcomes, where they can go out and see, touch, feel, be a part of that journey to achieving that decarbonization, really engage with farmers. I mean, George, we had 20 or so companies out on your farm recently, gone around in a tractor, and to be able to showcase the difference between a regeneratively farmed farm and also a non-regenerative farm, and hear that story that comes behind it is incredibly valuable. But it's underpinned by a need to achieve that net zero balance. So having that process, and so yeah, I think where does demand come from is could be said corporates, but ultimately it's about that ability to pair really high quality, high integrity, very true, Evie, very high global warming potential though. So within, if we look at that demand of where it's coming from, it's from corporates that really want to essentially showcase that they're helping the local community as a national level, and really want high integrity projects, as Tom says. And what do we mean by high integrity? Ultimately, that means that it's as far as is possible a permanent carbon removal. It has high additionality. Additionality means that it wouldn't have happened without carbon financing. So the decision that you're making to do this is a financial one, as well as an environmental one, as well as a business decision. So that all of those facets that come together, and then it's very the quantification is done really well. There's modeling involved, but there's also measurement involved and stuff like that. And then I think the key facet is around, I think carbon financing a lot of the time gets bundled up in this kind of esoteric carbon credit. Ultimately it is a financing mechanism to finance climate change mitigation and nature's loss. And I think really that's all it should be seen as. It is a very powerful tool to finance significant changes in the way that we are, and help finance decarbonization of farms, for example, as we've talked about here. So I'll stop waffling now, but really appreciate it.
Yep, thank you for that. Really appreciate that. Yeah, I like the way you frame that. Just looking at a climate mitigation avenue or way to do so. But one reservation I often hear is, well, what if that's just a way of greenwashing? What if companies don't particularly care about the climate? They just care about their public image, or they don't care about changing practice. They're just going to spend a little bit extra money, which they have a lot of, and not really change anything. Do you get that question often?
I mean, all the time. I think the key facet is, one is you can no longer make claims. It's called greenwashing. You can no longer make claims that if I do this thing, then I am carbon neutral, without having standards and codes that sit behind it. So just like in order to create the soil carbon and credit in the first place, you need the standards and codes. It's the same for organizations. So in years past, perhaps you would have claimed, I'm carbon neutral, and I would have been buying some credits that cost $3 a ton, no idea where they fall, kind of got the certificate, and I'm making this spurious claim. Ultimately, there are directives going on that are providing legal frameworks to essentially say that if you are found to be greenwashing, you're essentially committing a kind of fraudulent act, because you're misrepresenting consumers. And so if you're misrepresenting consumers, you have the Consumers' Rights Act and how that fits together. So there are ways in which where things are coming. And I think one of the key things to note is that every organization that we work with has some form of, it's within enrolled in some form of program, and every program that organizations signed up to or standard associated with making claims associated with either being carbon neutral or net zero it has a reduction part to it. So if you're using a carbon credit, by and large, you have to be reducing your carbon emissions, and I think that's really important to come across and to make sure that people get. But I also, I think it's important to realize that all money going towards climate change mitigation is good money, at its core. And I think there's two facets to that, which is we want more money coming into these programs because they're critically underfunded globally. So let's drive that capital in there, but let's do it in the right way. So I think for me, that's the important thing, is the standards that underpin what the businesses are doing.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And Matt or Tom, within this program, do you distinguish, or does, however your processes, however they work, do you distinguish who you sell these credits to? Like, do you vet them to make sure they have that mitigation plan moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very conscious of the buyer's sort of credentials in terms of efforts to reduce emissions and general nature positive actions, if you like. So the greenwashing risk is very much on our minds, and yeah, we've heard that from many farms, interestingly. So it's very much in our interest to vet buyers properly and ensure that they are making efforts to reduce emissions before they come to buy removals credits, for example.
Mm-hmm. And Jane here just asked, and I'm wondering the same thing. Did you guys say that companies can't buy a carbon credit unless they're reducing their own or have some kind of plan, or is that just something that certain programs like this one look for?
The companies can buy carbon credits, but ultimately, when you're making claims, there's a real risk now that you get accused of greenwashing as well, we know. And so from a corporate point of view, it's really important to be enrolled in a standards so that you can't be accused of making, essentially nefarious claims. So the organizations that we work with, they either work with something called PAS 2060, which is a BSI program, which is just nonsense acronyms as usual with sustainability, but nevertheless is a code around claiming carbon neutrality, and every organization within that has to have a reduction program to go through that. If you're buying for net zero, ultimately, as you buy for net zero, you have to be on that reduction journey. Because net zero is decarbonizing down to, by and large, 90% of your baseline emissions, which is probably set around 2019. And so if you're decarbonizing to that point, you can go no further. So it really depends on the use case, but the use case from a corporate point of view is by and large net zero. And if it is net zero, then they will have reduced their emissions by this point. So I think the answer to your question, Jane, is it's not one or the other, but ultimately, if you want to be working with the best quality companies and the best and the most sustainable companies who are willing to work with those really high quality programs, yeah, sure. Sorry, I keep reading the messages as I speak, which is a bit silly. I should maybe just come to them. So yeah. Anyway, like there's two standards. One is, I'll add these in a second. There are multiple different sets of standards. There's global ones. So there's something called the SBTI, which is the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is a quasi-governmental program. It's an NGO. It sits across without the sort of need of standards, but there are increasing this ISO standards. There are BSI standards. The UK Gov is really starting to push towards the BSI standards. There's something called BSI Flex 702. The Flex 700 series. I think we're up to 705, which is about setting the kind of framework around high quality nature-based carbon credits, basically. And it's not just carbon; it's natural capital as a whole, as such. So companies tend to work with sustainability organizations who can push them towards the right standards, but the gold standard really is the SBTI net zero standard, and they've got rules around what credits can and can't be used.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, if that's all right, Stu, with you, how about we switch to you producers, you farmers? So can I ask you and George, maybe George first, how can you as a farmer, as a producer, actually build carbon in your soil and potentially generate some of those credits? George, you're on mute.
First of the night. There you go. Someone had to do it. I think ultimately healthy soil is positively cycling carbon, so it's building carbon, and so the principles of soil health in keeping the soil covered, don't disturb the soil, keep living roots in the soil, increase your diversity, and integrate livestock. Those principles are all things that will be increasing the soil carbon stocks. So when we're looking at what we can do, it's really just farming in a way that is keeping the soil covered and healthy and feeding it through photosynthesis. And obviously, you know, as you've already alluded to, photosynthesis is the most crucial part of the whole thing, because it's where that carbon cycle starts. It's the taking the energy from the sun and breaking that carbon dioxide bond, and starting to put some in the soil and sugars to feed livestock or ultimately humans.
And I think one thing that's lost in this whole conversation is I often get the question, well, if I'm a farmer, why wouldn't I just get rid of all the carbon in my soil, then get it baselined, and then get paid for the gain? And what's lost is that the carbon in your soil, think about it, most organic matter, most mineral soils are between 0 to 8% organic matter, just roughly, generally, right? So that's 92% or more that's not organic matter. And that organic matter is the magic fraction that makes everything happen. And it could just be 3 to 5% of what's actually there, the stuff, right? So you don't want to get rid of it. That's the whole point, is your farm runs on life and it runs on carbon. And so if you're just going to ruin it and get rid of it, you're going to be ruining your farm in the process, so that's what I think is lost in this whole thing, is if you farm in such a way, as we call it, regenerative, you regenerate these ecosystem processes that run on solar energy, they run on carbon, they run on life. Your farm's going to be able to produce more. You're going to be able to mineralize more nutrients in the soil. You're going to be able to cut your fertility. You're going to have more natural predators and all that stuff. So that's the whole point, is farming regeneratively. Yes, carbon does come into the system more than goes out, and that's a wonderful thing for many reasons. But also your farm's just going to be more profitable and it's going to run more efficiently. So that's also why we should be doing these things. Matt, I see you unmuted. Do you have something to comment?
Well, just that, because that's a question we get a lot about. Well, surely the right thing to do would be to wreck my soils and then get a baseline, because then I'd have the most uplift. And I think that one of the things that we observe is that it takes 20, 50 years to move from a management change to feed through to reaching a new equilibrium. And so if you had a permanent pasture and you wanted to do some heavy cultivation to try and reduce the carbon, in year one, you might reduce the carbon a little bit, and the next year you might reduce it a little bit more. But you actually have to do it quite a long time to run the carbon down, to a point that you think that you get any benefit from doing so. And I think that it's often kind of the witty remark that's made, but in reality, by the time you've had all the cost of the cultivation and all the cost of reseeding and all the risk of doing all of that, I think that most farmers would rather keep their productive pasture or whatever they're currently farming, rather than try and chase some speculative carbon credit revenue by writing the farm off for a few years. So
I think if I can come in here briefly, the highest organic matter soils on my farm are all next to our dairy, where our dairy used to be, I should say. We stopped dairy farming in 1990, and those fields have been arable ever since, but they're still the highest organic matter fields on the farm. It takes a long time to break down the soil carbon stocks. It's taken most of us 70 or 80 years to break them down steadily with intensive agriculture, and you know, they're still at a level in this country. They're still at a level that we can farm sensibly. So yeah.
There's a question that's come in about baselining on farms that have root crops in the rotation, where you're not just necessarily cultivating, but also making beds, destoning, and so on, and around how baselining works in that scenario. So what we would typically see is that there's a rotation across the farm, and that root crops would be present in certain phases of that rotation. But if you show up in any given year and sample every field on the farm, you'll get fields that are in each stage of that rotation, and you'll also get fields that are, say, in sugar beet this year, were in sugar beet last year, 2 years ago, and so on. And you get that full picture across the rotation, across the farm. And so when that means that when you come back, yes, you in say 3-5 years time and do your resample, yes, that field that was in sugar beet in 2025 might be in wheat in 2028, but across the whole farm, you've seen how you've gone from that whole farm baseline with that rotation to a new carbon position at our remeasurement point. So I think that the key thing is thinking about it at the farm resolution, not necessarily at the field resolution. And in terms of, Kyle and Stuart, it'd be really interesting to hear your views on this, the potential for rotations with root crops to sequester carbon. I think from my perspective, if you start at a certain baseline, management changes from that point will cause you to reach a new equilibrium. So what you'll have is some phases of the rotation where maybe carbon's decreasing, but then phases where it's increasing, and so you kind of end up with this kind of lumpy rate of increase. But I don't know, it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that in terms of maybe some of these arable rotations where there's a lot of soil movement, what the potential is to increase carbon.
Yeah, absolutely. And gosh, that's something that Stu and I talk about quite a bit, is how can we increase soil function, soil ecosystem processes, soil organic matter in an arable rotation. And it can be done. There are guys out there like your John Kemps and your others that espouse that really healthy crops can photosynthesize better, and they can pump more photosynthate into the soil. And that's something I think is worth mentioning, is most soil organic carbon is built from the below ground plant material. That's both the roots and the exudates, the compounds that they exude, right? So the thinking is with healthier crops, that could be with better tissue sampling, sap analysis, and really targeted micronutrient and foliar applications, you can get maximized photosynthesis. So that's maximized sugar production. And so they have excess to send into the soil. So there is a school of thought, I think with all of this, it has to be remembered that there is a lot of research backing it, but we're also in the early days for a lot of this stuff, such as rhizosphere. So all the biology that's happening in the soil near the root, all the exudation. And, I think the research is there again, but it still is pretty early days. So to say, can we build organic matter and carbon levels and everything with just an arable rotation? Probably. I think there are definitely management steps you can take, such as going strip till, no till, reduced till, reducing your nitrogen fertilizer. Those kinds of things obviously have an effect. Now, where I think Stu and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Stu, come in is, do we need the whole rotation to be in arable crops, right? Can we have that time of, whether it's a few months with the cover crop or a couple of years with the lay? That's a really good inclusion and fusion into the system that's going to build soil organic matter and kind of build that fertility building period for then maybe you do have a really good market. Any kind of root crop, some kind of high disturbance crop might pay the bills and it might be pretty lucrative, but just understand that there is kind of a price that you pay. And so if you build up that bank account and then cash a little bit of it out, and on a 10-year scale, you've gone up a little bit. For me, that is being regenerative. That's how I look at it. Stu?
Yeah, I agree with that, Kyle. I think that the idea that we're going to be on an upward trajectory or a downward trajectory all the time, it's not feasible like that. We are going to go up and down, and we're going to ride through spells where uncontrollable events such as the weather and whatnot's going to come in and really impact on things as well. So, but when we're bringing in those, arable only scenarios, the idea that, can we change that slightly? Can we bring in some different crops? Can we bring in diversity year to year, as opposed to, just you don't have to complicate it all the time, I guess, if people don't want to, but certainly the more we engage with that, and George sort of touched on it before, the 6 principles of soil health and the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, the more we engage with that, the more that we'll hopefully see the benefits and actually the rate of that that carbon sequestration sort of increase, I think. And I think we've got to be really careful about how much we sort of talk that up to people, you know, because I think some people come at this and think, oh, we're going to farm carbon and become millionaires off the back of it and that sort of stuff. And I think we sort of flirted around the edge before, where I was going to just ask you, Matt or Tom or whoever wants to be, you know, when people come in and they talk about this carbon and they're just going to come into it and farm carbon and the farming's going out the window, what's your sort of response to that sort of inquiry?
Yeah, I think that, you know, from my perspective at least, you know, the key thing is that the farm business made sense, you know, and the decisions are made in the context of that farm business. And so, you know, as Tom said right at the start of the introduction, you know, we run a soil health program, and that's kind of what we see the primary function of what we do, is the focus is on using the soil health to benefit the farm profitability, productivity, resilience, and then the soil carbon, you know, follows in the progress. And so, you know, I think that on any farm, you know, there comes a point where you know, there's the perfect regenerative thing, if you like, which would be, you know, everything would be permanent pasture and it would be really long rest periods and really short grazing periods, and, you know, and that would be beautiful from a carbon perspective, but actually we're trying to produce food. And so, you know, as farmers, there's always going to come a point, I think, where, you know, we reach an optimum or a trade-off, if you like, between, well, this is the point where I'm going to decide this, I'm going to, you know, produce the crop, I'm going to, you know, get good growth rates on my lambs, I'm going to do whatever it is and make a decision that's, you know, producing food, the core farming business, but then seeking to get as much win-win of soil health and carbon in with that. And I think that, you know, the reason that we set the program up in the way we have is so that every decision is made in the context of what's right for the farming business, what keeps that farming business productive and profitable, and gets a carbon co-benefit, rather than, you know, reorienting a really good enterprise to chase, you know, a carbon revenue instead. I think that's, you know, completely the wrong approach. And it's also interesting, you know, to touch on some of the points that Luke and Tom were making. You know, what buyers of these credits are looking for is that the credits are still going to be in the ground in 10 years' time. And there's a much higher chance of that being the case if the decisions that are being made are good for that farming business, and that we as farmers have very good reason to continue farming in that way, rather than you know, a quick win or a quick buck, but then, you know, maybe a couple of years time actually, you know, there's a different management decision taken. So it's key to kind of getting the permanence credentials and therefore the premium value for that credit as well. The decisions are ultimately what's right for the farm.
Thanks for clarifying that, Matt. I think it's quite important just to get that sort of message out, that, you know, that you guys, as much as we are looking to see what carbon is generated, it's the farm and businesses first and foremost. So it's good to sort of clarify that for people, I think. Kyle, anything you want to add there?
No, I don't think so. I think that's such a great point, though. Like, it's a both and situation with what, if you want to call it regenerative agriculture, eco-ag, whatever. You know, we can farm in such a way on a long term, on a 5-10 year plan, that it's better for the environment, it's better for water quality, air quality, soil quality, all these things, and farm business productivity and profitability. So that's the cool thing that I think excites me. It's not an either or. We don't have to choose the environment or farm profitability and resiliency as a business. It's both. And that's the fun part for George, Stu, and myself, is going on the farm and figuring out, listening to your context. You know, what are your local markets? What's your infrastructure in your farm? What are you set up to do? And then every farm can improve. And so how can we make those improvements? That's the fun part for me. So, Stu, if I may, Evie, I appreciate you've asked this question a couple times now. So I thought maybe we get into it. I think we were gonna maybe closer to the end talk about this, but you know, we're getting towards that time. So Evie asks, if you have less than 100 hectares of land and can't afford to measure soil carbon in the way RO does, how do you guys suggest us less wealthy folk should measure our soil carbon baseline? I'd really like you to answer. Tom or Matt?
A comment from my side is that our regenerate outcomes, we were set up for exactly that purpose, is essentially de-risking this for farms, because it is expensive to measure soil carbon, especially on repeated basis, so rolling measurements over many years. So we cover all the costs of our mentoring and the soil carbon measurement, so farms can just focus on farming, enjoying that creative process with the mentoring team, becoming more nimble as a manager, really in tune with their soil health, etc. And we cover all the cost of services in exchange for a share of the credits over time. So we think that's a good way of setting this up. So we're leveraging the carbon finance to provide a really good mentoring service, the best in the world. Let's just say that to farmers, and we're taking the risk on the costs of measurement. So so farms don't have to pay those upfront costs, which are sizable. So on the basis that you as a farm want to measure soil carbon stocks across your whole farm, so let's say a landscape scale survey, you're looking at 30 to 50 pounds a hectare to get the Can-Ams on site. Obviously they're different suppliers, but roughly speaking, that's a guide. So we can do that centrally across many farms. So that's one of the advantages of RO being a kind of central supplier, if you like. There's an economy of scale which we can achieve where you as a standalone farm, it's expensive and you may not get the same economy of scale. So good point.
Great, thank you very much.
I guess maybe just to I guess touch on the other aspect of Evie's question. You know, ultimately, you know, in any program like ours, there's some costs that are you know, at the hectare resolution, there's some costs at the farm resolution that, you know, unfortunately means that there's then a minimum size of farms that we can work with to kind of, you know, just make the costs stand up and make sense. And so, you know, obviously for some farms and some farmers, you know, the area that they work on is too small, and unfortunately, you know, we're not currently set up to work with farms below a certain size. I think in terms of the options, then, you know, you'd be looking at things like, you know, you could obviously get your own baseline, but as Tom says, that's quite expensive. You know, there's carbon calculators that do estimates that are cheap, but then less context specific. And so, you know, it might be more of a local value chain approach that you might take to, you know, if you're direct selling any of your produce, and then can potentially think about ways to get value from your carbon in that way. But I think that, you know, unfortunately, as with, you know, I guess, you know, lots of other aspects of farming, you know, there comes a point where, you know, you get to a scale to afford a tractor, you know, and other things in farming are kind of unfortunately linked to that sort of scale. I think that to an extent it is, you know, similar with things like carbon credits. There's a scale at which it starts to make sense, and maybe for those smaller opportunities, you know, the environmental focus on your farm might be biodiversity or water outcomes or whatever it might be, rather than necessarily trying to get a carbon credit per se on a particularly small area. I'm not saying you have to have a tractor. I was trying to draw an analogy.
Well, it looks like David Johnson actually is attending, and so if that's the David Johnson of Johnson Sioux fame, it's nice to have you. I really appreciate you sending that paper. That might be good for everybody to read. So nice to have you. Daisy asks, do the regenerative outcomes credits come with any formal verification or documentation of the regen practices taken to deliver that soil carbon?
So as Tom described a few moments ago, one of the key steps in the verification standard is that third-party audit by a verifier. And so what an organisation like Regenerate Outcomes would do is present the verifier with a list of all the farms in the programme and all the fields that they've entered into the programme, and then we would have management data that go along with each of those fields. And then we also have the soil carbon baseline and in time the resample data that comes from those fields as well. And so we can link management change in each field with the measured increase in soil carbon on each field, and that's what ultimately causes the credits to be generated. And so what happens is the verifier comes in and essentially audits all of that to make sure that you know, yes, we have measured an increase, and yes, those management changes have occurred, and that will even include site visits onto some of the farms to see, visit the fields and verify that, if we're claiming that, I don't know, a cover crop's being grown there or no-till has been adopted or whatever it might be, that the actual practices have happened on the ground. And then once that process is complete, those credits are verified and then listed on a registry. But that, so what that kind of confirmation that the management practice has caused the carbon increase happens at that verification step. What you don't get is a credit that says this is a herbal lay credit, or this is a no-till credit, or this is a adaptive multi-paddock grazing credit. The link with the management it is done at the verification point.
Very good. Thank you very much. And then Evie also tacked on, but what's the next best way to measure that soil carbon, maybe in her context? Matt, what do you think about just your standard organic matter levels, tracking that over time, given that there is a correlation between soil carbon and organic matter levels?
There is, yeah, but I guess a lot of the kind of common ag labs would also offer a soil carbon stock assessment as well. So if you take a sample of a known volume and send it to them, they'll be able to give you your organic matter and your bug density, and then if you know the depth you've taken the sample, that will give you your stock. And so probably the best approach in that sort of position would be to contact someone like Landcrop and just ask them what they would recommend as the best way to collect those samples, what depth, core diameter, and so on, so that you can then get a meaningful carbon result back. But any kind of commercial lab out there will be able to get you your soil carbon stock, and then you can go and collect some samples around the farm to get a kind of a baseline.
And I don't want to keep going back to it. Is it really relevant what Evie's actually trying to do when she's taking this carbon? When she's asking these questions, it really depends on what she's hoping to do with that results. Because if ultimately if you're going to try and sell carbon credits, you're going to have to go through the official sort of pathways. I assume, is that right? It's if that's the intended goal at the end of that, obviously you'll have to go through some sort of official pathway to make that verifiable or monetizable.
Yeah, I think there's different options, right? So, what we're, is what, Tom and Luke have been describing, and all the piece around verification, that's trying to get to that top of the market, that premium credit that comes with all the verification and all the kind of assurance around that. If you're, on a very small scale, you're not going to be going through a standard like that, so, you're probably looking to find a local buyer that is really engaged in your farm, has a connection to your area or your landscape, and is willing to pay, say a fair value for some maybe unverified carbon gains that have come from just up the road from them, so to speak. So, yeah, you wouldn't be going down a verified route. You'd be looking for kind of a local value chain route in that instance.
Thank you. There's also a really good question coming here about the RO complying with the PA S2060 standards. Is it worth touching on that? And then what happens if government regs come in that sort of changes how RO fits in alongside that?
Yeah, so we're part of an advisory group which was set up by British Standards Institute, BSI, which Luke mentioned earlier. So the BSI Flex 700 series is essentially government overseeing underlying standards like the gold standard, verified carbon standard, ISO, etc. So they don't want to stymie the market; they want to encourage it. That's been made very clear. Even in the text of SFI, they've been very clear that private finance is available to be stacked on top of SFI, for example. So the government is keen to encourage this market, and those overarching standards essentially just make sure that projects meet those targets as well as the underlying standards. And that, to be fair, they're very aligned. They've been based on the standards themselves, a lot of these guidance papers. So verified carbon standard is the oldest standard, which has been around for over 20 years. 1 billion credits have traded from it. It's got a public and transparent registry. It's generally regarded as a good standard. And as I say, we're working with government to make sure that we're contributing to the advisory group about how the government's going to oversee individual underlying standards. So in terms of that PAS 2060 standards, to be honest, we're not following those specifically, but by complying with a verified carbon standard and working with BSI, we're pretty confident that we're compliant, let's say, with what government is seeking. So yeah.
I think there's two facets to this as well from a buyer's perspective. Our role working, alongside RO and others is to ensure that it does comply, providing that kind of trust and transparency overlay from a buyer's point of view, as well as from a kind of from the point of view of helping to kind of distribute those credits. And I think there's two facets to this. So one is, that compliance will come from corporate demand. So corporate demand will ensure compliance with the necessary standards. And then on the other side, I think is the standards are continually evolving. The standards are not static, so they're continuing evolving in line with new science, new government regulation, and are ultimately being adhered to at that level. So it's not a static program, and the standards are moving forward with best scientific endeavors, just as RO are doing and the rest of the industry. So I think the kind of question is, the answer is simply it will always be applicable to the standards that are required from a carbon point of view for corporates.
Yeah, I'll also add that this whole market is very, very young, and it, as Luke said, it's going to evolve considerably. So I think the important thing is to get a baseline under what is currently what is good scientific protocol, let's say, which a good standard ensures. Get a baseline done under a standard, and get the clock ticking, because we can be waiting and talking about this for years. But we take the view that provided we do things responsibly in a good way, we can get the clock ticking and capture value for farmers as soon as possible. So and get the mentoring service to the farms, which that's the key part of what we're doing, is enabling marginal gains towards regenerative farming with the help of the mentoring team, so that you as a farmer end up in a better place years down the line. Just from a knowledge perspective, I think that's absolutely critical. So if you take the transaction of the carbon credit aside, the mentoring delivers cumulative knowledge over years, and so you as a farm manager will be more knowledgeable, nimble, in a better place years down the line. That's our goal, really, at RO.
Yeah, I think we said it at one point, one of the workshops. RO genuinely is a soil health, farm resiliency building company that's funded for by the carbon credits, rather than a carbon credit program that just kind of wants to dabble into helping farmers and consulting with them and looking good from a PR perspective. So I really do think that's why Gabe and Alan, they get contacted by so many of these programs, and they've only agreed to work with one. They agreed to work with you guys because you guys genuinely want to help the farmer. And then the number one thing that farmers need help with is education and mentoring, because they can't implement what they don't know. And Robert here asked, where can we get the advice for regenerating our soils on a small farm without thinking about that financial incentive? And that's a very good question. And it's really cool. We live in a day and age where knowledge is everywhere. And so I would just say, look on YouTube, talk to neighbors. And Stu, you probably agree with this. And George, the number one way you can get education on your own farm is to try it out for yourself. Put it to the test and learn what works on your own farm in your own context. That would be my number one piece of advice.
Yeah, start small. Don't try and do it across the whole farm. That would be my first bit of advice.
Mm-hmm.
I think this space has come on leaps and bounds over the last 10, 12, 15 years, whereby, information was limited. There was sort of people trialing and testing stuff, and that has really, really ramped up in the last 5 years, especially. The access to information now is phenomenal compared to what we were sort of dealing with years and years and years ago. So And there's a multitude of people who are bringing loads of different tricks and ideas to the party. So I think it's a good case to sort of explore what's out there and see who's available and not who's available, what sort of different systems resonate well with you. And then as George said, try something, just do something. You know, we have people who think and talk about it and never actually do anything. And then on the flip side, you can be someone who just goes straight out and starts doing something. But ultimately, if we don't do anything ever, we'll never know. So just try something, try small, try something that you're comfortable with at whatever level you're comfortable with, and then hopefully get some positive results that sort of build that motivation to keep going, as it were. So.
I think as well that ties in really nicely to the question that Daisy's asked a couple of times now, which is, you know, given the requirements for additionality from carbon credit buyers, and the fact that a lot of kind of maybe soil health beneficial practices are now paid for through SFI, how is additionality proven on those sorts of contexts? And I think that it's that kind of the education and the learning aspect that's absolutely key to a program like ours. Is that, you know, we're not sitting here asking farmers to do single prescriptive practices. Instead it's the opportunity to work with a mentor, whether that's Kyle or Stu or George, to start doing some of these trials on your farm and kind of move your whole farm down that route using a framework like the 634. And so, you know, if you look at an SFI situation where people have got, you know, a single option on each parcel of land, and, you know, it comes with a set of management prescriptions, you know, maybe they're growing a herbal ley, but after a couple of years, you know, how diverse is that sward? You know, maybe it's really good, but, you know, a lot of herbal leys, maybe the diversity really starts to decline. Whereas in a program like ours, you're working with the mentoring team to really build and maintain diversity within that ley through good grazing practices. And so I think that the two key points are around not just being paid for an action, but actually making that really succeed on the farm so that you generate the outcome that's then of interest. But the second part is it's not just about implementing individual single actions, but rather adopting a whole framework and set of principles that really causes soil health and therefore carbon to be built in those soils. And so even though individual options might be paid for by government subsidy, that's a very different thing to an education-based program that causes outcomes to really fly. And so, you know, with the verification standard we work with, they've kind of fully accepted that case, that there's a big difference between an actions-based payment and a program that really causes outcomes to be accelerated on a farm. And that's kind of where we prove the additionality, is by using ultimately the carbon credit revenue to pay for that mentoring and that education to cause the positive outcomes to be delivered.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I only really see one more question that has been answered, and that's good because I think our time is winding down here. So Roger asked, what's the situation about stacking other schemes such as BNGs?
So the short answer is it's case by case. So with BNG in England, and I appreciate this is quite context specific, but English government set out rules for how biodiversity net gain is done, and that does preclude stacking with carbon. So basically they say you can't get carbon revenues and BNG revenues on the same parcel of land. And we have a number of farmers that do have BNG options in place, and what they do in that instance is they take a field out from our program and do BNG on that field. With other outcomes, maybe it's water quality and so on, it would come down to the specific terms of the agreement. But broadly speaking, the rule of thumb is that you can't get paid for doing exactly the same thing twice from two different people. But if one payment by itself wouldn't be enough to cause the action or the outcome to be delivered, then it is possible to kind of stack multiple payments for different things, so maybe carbon and water, that causes an action to happen that wouldn't have otherwise happened. What is becoming more common is what's called bundling, where instead of being paid by a water company for a water outcome and a offset buyer for a carbon outcome, what would instead happen is, say, you would generate a premium carbon credit which would be sold to the water company, and so the water company would buy a carbon credit that comes with some water quality benefits, for example, and so you kind of bundle them in and you get more for that carbon credit than you would have done had it gone to someone that wasn't a water company. And so that approach is kind of becoming more prevalent than the stacking model. I think if you've got any questions like that, like, feel free to get in touch with us after the meeting as well, and kind of see what the context is on your farm, and we can help you work through some of those questions in the detail.
Great, thanks for that, Matt. I was just about to say that same thing there, that there's a whole host of different farms out there, and everyone has their own particular context in which they're working. So if you've got more questions, I'm sure Matt and Tom and the rest of the team are very happy to field any of those at any point. So do get in touch with them all. So that'd be great. Kyle, do you think that's pretty much it for questions? Has anyone else got any more comments they'd like to put in here before we do draw this to a close? We've got sort of 2 minutes left, really, but that's about it. So.
No, I think we touched on everything that I wanted to touch on. I just want people to really understand that carbon is so essential to everything. I think of a water wheel. It's the water that makes everything go around. The more carbon we have cycling, the more life we have, the more functionality we have on our landscapes. And I think that's the whole point of programs like this and having conversations about soil organic matter and carbon. So yeah, I think we did a good job. And thanks for all the guests for coming.
Thanks very much for having me.
Just before we shut this down, there is one more question here that Jane's saying that hasn't been answered about resting land. So she is asking, what's your thoughts on resting grassland? What's your perspective on resting grassland? I mean, obviously that comes under varying context. It's going to determine that. But what would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, I can start. I would just say, in general, I think every landscape on Earth evolved with livestock, with herbivores, and so it depends what you mean by resting. So like in the U.S., we have programs called CRP, and sometimes that can lead to a degradation of the landscape when it's not being managed enough. So I think, and obviously there are farms that are managed too much with their grassland. So I think with what we teach, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, or just grazing and managing that grassland in such a way that we are building ecosystem function, it can be done with human management. So it really depends on what you mean by resting. Resting grassland could be putting an arable field in grass for 5 years and managing that could be, so it just depends, I suppose, on our question. But just in general, I would say we as humans can manage grassland in such a way to improve it over time. Absolutely.
We have a tendency, and I think especially over the last 50 years or so, to not rest anything. And I think a lot of land that we go out and dig holes in is screaming out for a little rest of some sort. And then we need to make sure that we don't let it rest too long, where, like you say, that it slips back into dormancy, but we rest it enough for it to recover, and then we can give it a bit of a rest, and then bring in those purposeful disruptions that then keep that biology stimulated and keep everything moving. So rest is fantastic, but don't give it too long, sort of thing. So super. I think we are drawing to an end here. I think time's up, and hopefully everyone's learned some of this. I just want to say thanks very much to RO for putting this on. It's really good to help answer these questions, or be part of listening to people answer these questions. I certainly didn't know a huge amount about all this sort of stuff, so it's really helpful for me as well. But hopefully everyone else has got a lot of this as well. Just want to say thank you for everyone coming on, especially Luke and George, who've sort of come on as extra guests here, which is fantastic. Tom and Matthew for answering all those questions that are really complex and more specific to RO and soil management as well. But it's really good to have you on as well and answer those questions. And thanks very much for everyone who's turned up and made this very engaging. This has been pinging at me for the last hour, my computer here, and trying to determine all the messages has been an interesting challenge. So thanks for that, guys.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks again. Have a good evening. Cheers.